Hey folks, let's dive into security control in this video going over Zoho's security permissions and data sharing rules. So we're going to get started over here on the main settings screen under users and control. You can see a security control tab, and this is going to take us to Zoho CRM's profiles. Now a profile is really the set of permissions that a user is given when they enter into the CRM. These profiles govern not only what modules or fields a user can see, edit, add, delete, etc., but also all of the backend permissions of what kind of email templates they can create, whether they can share records, whether they have API access. So it's incredibly important that you take the time to set up profiles correctly for your organization. Now, out of the box, Zoho comes with two main profiles, your administrator profile and your standard profile. It's a good idea to really limit the number of users that have the administrator profile, since this is giving you full access to the system, ability to mass import and even mass export everything from the system. You certainly don't want users to have those permissions, and having full API access can certainly be problematic as well. The standard profile, while better, also is fairly limiting. We don't actually have permission to change some of the options within the standard profile. So you can see here that some adjustments have been made in this demo account, but you also don't have the option of actually turning off certain features. In my opinion, most folks should not use the standard profile because it gives a lack of control over some of these features that I like to turn off for the majority of users. So let's head back to the main screen here and see some of the typical profiles that we recommend as a starting point. Of course, every organization will have a unique permissions rules for their organization, but here's a good starting point. Your main super admin user will be the only user on the administrator profile. I'll recommend just skipping the standard profile. Unfortunately, you cannot delete it. And then you can go ahead and create a standard general user profile. Now, a general user profile is for all of your main operatives within your organization. And these folks, for the most part, do not need delete permission on any of the main records. When it comes to things like tasks, meetings, notes, of course, you want them to be able to keep the system clean, so it's a good idea to give delete permissions for those modules. But for your core leads, accounts, contacts, deals, it can be problematic if you have a user go ahead and delete an account, for example, when other departments may need access to that. So typically a manager level or above will need to perform any delete permissions. So walking through the modules here, you can see that the reports and analytics I've also marked as just view only. Now, some users may very well understand the system enough to generate their own reports and dashboards. However, it can be quite tricky to make sure that you get the reports built correctly. So typically I will have an IT department or a system admin be responsible for building the reports and giving others the ability to consume them so that they can rely on getting accurate data from those reports. Your products module, this is also something that can be a little problematic if you give all users access to create. I've just renamed the standard products module here services and products. The reason why you may not want to give all users the ability to create products is that if you turn on the sync with the finance suite, you're going to be creating products in your accounting system as well. And the moment that you have a transaction created against a particular product, you actually can't delete that product. And this can really clutter up your chart of accounts, and you can have potentially duplicate items under different chart of accounts, and it can get a little messy. So again, something that is best reserved for an administrator to add. Campaigns is fine to view, edit, and create. Same thing with vendors, although you may want to be a little bit careful there if you go through any kind of vetting process for onboarding new vendors into your system, you may want to just give the ability to view. This is the standard desk tab, so if you've integrated the CRM with desk, that's okay to allow users to view desk tickets. This is an extension with Zoho Sign. It allows you to generate sign envelopes and documents through Zoho Sign using Zoho CRM's mail merge functionality. We'll dive deeper into that on our Zoho Sign walkthrough, but typically you may want to give users the ability to do full view, edit, create, but if it comes to completed documents, you may not want them to be able to delete those completed documents. Now, custom modules are obviously going to be unique to your organization, so we have a few custom modules in the system. Just be cognizant of whether a user really needs the ability to delete. I prefer to be a little bit more conservative, especially getting started with the system, and then you can always ease up on the permissions, but rather be a little bit more strict and conservative and ease up than give too many permissions and have problems arise. So going down here to some of the actual settings permissions within the system, we have the ability to import records. Now, typically, I would recommend that you have an administrator or IT department import records because there could be other implications that happen when you import records. In some cases, you may want certain automations to run, and in other cases, you may want to withhold that. So just be cognizant that when you import records, you're affecting a lot of change potentially in the system. Sometimes custom functions may or may not run, and you may be overriding data, you may be updating data. Important metrics like created dates may get updated, and you may lose some historical activity in the timeline on a record. So again, make sure that you're really careful whom you give access to. On the export side, similar thing. Of course, you don't want your reps running off with your database. It certainly may be part of your use case to allow others to export certain modules of data and keep others locked down. So you can actually specify on all of these settings which modules that particular permission is allowed for. Sending emails, this is typically fine, but I try to lock down any kind of mass action for a general user. So I would not recommend that you give mass emailing capabilities. Having a manager or an administrator go through and approve any kind of mass communications is probably a good idea. Typically, we'll actually prevent users from deleting emails. Now, you want to have that track record in the system so you can keep a history of any correspondence your organization has with clients or vendors. Mail merge is pretty benign. You can give that permission to everyone. You may want your managers to approve some of the templates, but then allowing users to merge data into an approved template should be just fine. Getting into some of the tool permissions, mass update, again, I generally recommend that any kind of mass action is reserved for managers. So turning off mass update, mass delete, changing owners can be fine, although there are other ways that you can actually achieve a change in ownership with an approval process. So if you have that need where you may want to have a rep elect to change owner to another user, but have the manager approve that change, we have a little tip and trick that you can add an additional user field to that module, give the rep that wants to make the change access to edit that particular user field for a requested change of ownership, and then have a notification that goes to the manager where they can approve it, and then just a little workflow rule and function that will update the actual owner of the record to that approved user that was requested. That way you can actually lock down ownership so that you don't have reps actually stealing each other's leads or accounts. When it comes to mass transfers, similar thing, you may want to reserve that for a manager. There are some really easy ways to do some mass transfers of accounts and all of the related records to a new rep, especially if you're offboarding someone who's leaving and onboarding a new rep and needing to reassign those accounts. A manager can do that in bulk. The conversion process, most reps will need to be able to convert, so that's an easy one to leave on. Again, mass convert, really reps shouldn't have any need to do anything in mass and should have IT approval to affect that amount of change. Sharing, depending on how you run your territory rules and data sharing rules, this may or may not be okay depending on your unique circumstances. Getting down to these other permissions, print view is pretty benign, simply the ability to print off a screenshot essentially of a record. Now sheet view is another story. Sheet view is actually a really cool feature within the CRM that allows you to actually view a list of records in a spreadsheet type view. So it makes it very easy to do a lot of bulk edits in a format that a lot of us are very familiar with. This can be somewhat risky though, because you can edit up to 100 records at a time, and then those records may execute other workflow rules or automations that you may have set up in the system. So just be careful that if you give this sheet view permission, you are essentially giving users the mass update capabilities. Getting into the find and merge, this again should really be a managerial or IT function. You don't want reps erroneously merging the wrong records and picking and choosing which is the primary record that other records are getting merged into. Can be extremely important, especially if you have API integrations where you're mapping the primary key, that Zoho record ID, from one system to another. If you merge accounts the wrong way, you may lose that primary key that could affect a sync to a third-party system. Custom views, this is something that you can give users the ability to manage their own custom views, but I recommend that you do a training to make sure that they select that they're only creating views for themselves, not for the whole organization. What we find is that companies that allow a lot of users to leverage the custom views, which is a great feature, can get very cluttered over time, and it eventually becomes unusable. So make sure that they are only creating the views for themselves and not for the whole team. Tags can be quite useful as well in certain circumstances, but be careful not to get too tag heavy. That can lead to some problems just in managing the amount of this meta information on a record. Zoho does limit you to 10 tags per record, so that in and of itself may be limiting for a lot of different use cases. Diving into the setup permissions here. Now these, it's clearly labeling that most of these are going to be admin level permissions. So for a general user, you really aren't going to be allowing them to do any kind of user management, compliance settings. This is a lot to do with like GDPR and email opt-outs. User management is typically onboarding new users and defining the roles and permissions of that user. Module customization, this is affecting the actual modules themselves, the fields, the grouping of those fields, and how the layout of the CRM functions. Portals, we'll do a whole new video on portals in general. So this is certainly going to be an admin feature because you've got to be very careful about what data you may be sharing outwards to the public. Same thing with managing those portal users and your calendaring for the organization. Diving into our email templates here. Email and chat settings, you have to turn this on if you want to give the user the ability to connect their Gmail or their Zoho Mail, Office 365 to the CRM. When they connect that email to the CRM, it's going to actually match any emails from their inbox with that contact record in the CRM, and it's going to show those emails within the CRM so other colleagues in the system can see communication across the whole organization with that person. We'll dive into some security implications with that as well in the video going over the email integration. A couple things to note is that you typically want to exclude your own domain so that your internal emails don't start popping up in the system if one of your colleagues actually puts one of their own contact records in the system. Another thing to take of note is that if you do the email integration with the IMAP as opposed to POP3, the IMAP integration, when you disable that user in your Office 365 or G Suite, it's going to actually remove all of those emails from the CRM. You would actually have to change that integration to the POP3 type to save those emails in the CRM. So that may need to be a part of your offboarding when you're decommissioning a user. Managing templates, fairly straightforward. Again, organization is key, making sure you have a good folder structure and giving adequate permissions for different people to view and edit those templates that need that access. On the automation side, you certainly don't want junior folks managing automation and affecting change in the system. Same thing goes for any kind of escalation rules or assignment rules. Those are fairly straightforward, so don't want reps messing with your lead assignment allocations. When it comes to web forms, the CRM web forms have certainly become more robust, so we are starting to see them being used more often. More often than not, though, folks will end up using Zoho Forms or a proper form builder like Jot Forms or Gravity Forms on their website and integrating that. But for those of you that want to dive into the web forms, pretty straightforward that this is going to be an IT function. Diving into our data administration, you certainly don't want general users being able to migrate data from other CRMs. Seeing import history, that's not going to be relevant unless you're really on the admin side. Same thing goes for viewing storage details and then managing the sandbox. Sandbox is certainly a very powerful feature, but can also be very problematic if not done in the right way. So please be sure to check out our videos on appropriate change management best practices and some tips and tricks with Zoho CRM Sandbox so you don't get yourself into a trap. Diving into Zia, Zoho's AI. So some of these are going to be fine for general users to see her or its recommendations. So nothing too much to worry about there. Something of caution though is that if you leverage the data enrichment, be cognizant that that may overwrite some data that you have in the system, so users need to be trained appropriately. On the Zoho side, admins will be responsible for integrating some of the Zoho apps. If you are extending into connecting phone systems or wanting to view other Zoho app data within the CRM, you can turn that functionality on here. So across the whole finance suite, being able to view, add, edit invoices within the CRM. And we'll do some deeper dives into these features, so be sure to check out those videos. Again, all of these should typically be turned on if general users can go ahead and view and create invoices. But if only managers can have access to that, you can turn it off for the general user and turn it on for a manager profile. Be careful with the any syncs with third-party systems. Something to be cognizant about is if you give a permission in Zoho for a particular feature and that user does or doesn't have that permission in the other system, if you're setting up a sync, they could work around rules. And you can see here that I've turned off the syncing of Google Contacts because you may prevent a user from being able to delete a contact in the CRM, but what happens if they can delete that same contact in your Google contacts? Then when the sync happens, they may actually be deleted in Zoho as well. And believe it or not, we've had cases where we've seen full databases wiped out in Zoho because a full contact list where a rep had access to all the organization's contacts was clearing up his contact list, deleted all the organization contacts, and they were subsequently removed from Zoho. So be careful about that. Any kind of two-way sync, you really need to think through. Again, these are all going to be admin permissions, and there'll be subsequent videos diving into each of these features, but the last thing that I really wanted to bring of note here is the developer permissions. This is something you're really going to want to lock down, especially when it comes to some of your manager profiles. Even those managers or directors probably shouldn't have full API access to the system, especially managing extensibility, which is authorizing third-party apps to connect to Zoho, and managing organization variables. This should really be an IT function, and you should really limit the number of users who can connect to third-party apps, because they need to be vetted by an IT department. When a third party has access to Zoho's API, they typically will have access to everything. So keep that in mind, that API access oftentimes means that apps can read, write, delete anything in your system, and you should probably be vetting that third-party app security and terms and conditions to make sure that it matches your organization's requirements. So that was a quick run through of all of these permissions. Again, you're going to want to start by being a little bit more locked down. Create a general user profile. Rule of thumb, general users cannot delete anything. They shouldn't have any kind of permissions to affect any kind of bulk change in the system. We also want to limit the amount of admin permissions when it comes to automation, setups, controls, as well as API access. One step above that will be your manager profiles. Managers can do things in bulk. They may be able to delete records. They may be able to manage templates, but I would caution you from allowing them to manage automation. Your IT role may be able to manage the automation, do imports, exports, perhaps have access to the API, and then of course your main administrator profile has access to everything. So I hope that provides a good overview of where to start with security controls with profiles. We'll be diving into the data access permissions in terms of what records users can see in our video going over roles, data sharing settings, and territory management. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you on the next video. Cheers.